Hello.
Welcome to another webinar, another VeraMed webinar. And this time it's again myself and Rachel, and we will talk about real-world evidence. It's a buzzword that comes up all the time. And today we'll dig a little bit deeper into it. What are actually the different aspects of real-world evidence, and where's it coming from? And what are the different viewpoints? And also, what can you do with it, as well as some trends in the future? And with that, let me hand over to Rachel.
All right, welcome. So I'm going to start off talking by something that maybe is quite close to home for everyone right now. So as you know, there's a large-scale current example of typical challenges we see in real-world evidence. And this is being showcased by the vaccines and the pandemic that are going on right now. They give a good example of safety and efficacy and how this is changing with different mutations and different populations. The booster and the infection rates have been able to show us hospitalization, been able to compare things with vaccinated and unvaccinated. And overall, I think is a great case because it's quite large scale.
Yep, you can actually see how, the clinical trial results were initially very good to predict the efficacy in the real-world situation. But as the mutations went on, different patients got vaccinated, lots of different parameters changed over time. And so the initial difference that we have seen in terms of unvaccinated versus vaccinated is not there anymore. Things in terms of care also changed in the background. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty of how to treat patients most effectively. And over the period of the pandemic, additional treatments have come on board. And of course, they also have an effect on the, for example, mortality rate in standard of care patients that were initially studied in the in these treatment studies, in the phase 3 studies for the vaccinations. So lots of parameters changed. And this is not only the case here, it is a case for lots of different medications. Once you have launched your new product, there's always a need for real-world evidence to help physicians, patients, and payers to make good decisions, whether they want to prescribe, how they want to prescribe, when they want to prescribe your medication, and of course, also how let's get reimbursed. Let's move over to the next slide. And let me give you a little bit of a background on Rachel, because she has quite a lot of experience in this field. She has worked across different phases in preclinical, being a data manager, programmer, but specifically, she has a lot of hands-on experience with real-world evidence, as she has been, a programmer in that state, a statistician in that state, and has lots of experiences. So both in the UK as well as with anonymized patient databases. So it's really good that we have such an expert here today.
Thank you, Alexander. And you probably are familiar with Alexander's voice being on the Effective Statistician podcast. However, he has extensive experience in pharmaceutical companies, 3 of them, 3 large ones, in fact. He has 17 years of launch and commercialization experience, multiple publications in many different areas. He's done HTA submissions around the globe, and he's known for his statistical leadership, both globally and locally. So let's start off with a poll question. Let's see what the audience thinks. What is real-world evidence? We've got a few options here for you to choose from.
Okay, let's see what's coming there. Observational research. Oh, someone is ticking in direct comparisons. Oh, that's a good one. Another one for observational research. Some more. Yeah, it is actually a little bit of a tricky thing, what real-world evidence is and where it's coming from. Okay. So, what is real-world evidence?
Well, according to the FDA, real-world evidence is essentially any study using real-world data. The FDA defines it as evidence, the clinical evidence regarding the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medicinal product derived from analysis of real-world data. So, since this definition relies heavily on the definition of real-world data, let's see what the audience has to say about what they think real-world data is.
And so you have a couple of examples that you can choose from. What is real-world data? And of course, yeah, more or less could apply. Okay, claims databases, variable data. Nobody yet ticked PK data, so that is for pharmacokinetics, patient-reported outcomes. Yeah, so we had the radio buttons here, so you can choose only one, but of course more can be right. And it's good that nobody has chosen PK data, which is in most cases not real-world data, unless there's very, very specific situations. So, what is real-world data? That's pretty clear, isn't it?
Well, there seems to be a lot of different definitions, and they all don't really agree quite yet. But leading industries have provided some of these guidelines. According to the FDA, it's data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected from a variety of sources. Whereas ISPOR, the Professional Society for Health Economics and Outcomes Research, has a slightly broad term, and it's basically sources that other than traditional clinical trials. So I find it interesting that sometimes they might be focused on how the data is collected, less so what data is collected, and in other instances, it's more focused on what data is collected.
Yeah, that is a really important point. First, there's no kind of consistent approach to it, and different organizations call it differently. And you can come up, of course, here with a couple of different things that would potentially fall in one, but not the other area. So, for example, you could say kind of real-world data that come from sources other than traditional clinical trials. So, for example, the indirect comparisons we have talked about before are coming from publications, not necessarily could be clinical trials, but not necessarily clinical trials. So that would be, under the ISPOR definition, but probably not so much on the FDA definition. Yeah. Whereas PRO data, for example, collected in a clinical trial or variable data could be actually fall under the FDA definition, but not under the ISPOR definition.
Yeah, so as you can see, there's a lot of differences, so much that it's inspired some research to be collected. And I think that this paper was really interesting because it showcased the increasing recognition and value of real-world data, but it highlighted that the definition of real-world data is a little bit on the lacking side. And in particular, this is needed in order to have kind of consensus, and if different stakeholders have different definitions of what real world data is, it can lead to disparities in terms of decision making and also in discussions of real world data.
Yeah, and you see that all the time. Yeah, if you look into the different departments in different companies that manage real world data or real world evidence, they are not always responsible for the same things. Yeah, and some companies, for example, that includes patient-reported outcomes and how that is set up. In other companies, there's specific departments for that. In some companies, real-world evidence also includes, for example, network meta-analysis and other indirect comparisons, whereas that potentially is more in the field of health economics in other companies. So what is, if you have a company and it says, I'm working in real-world evidence, that is not necessarily always the same. So there's quite a lot of differences. And by the way, that has sparked also quite a lot of different labels for these departments as well. So sometimes these departments have kind of combinations of acronyms to better describe what actually is behind that, which is another kind of thing that doesn't really help to make things easier across companies. So in order to have a little bit of a closer look into this, it's really good to understand what are different factors that drive, what is understood by real-world data or evidence. And let's look into this in the next slide. The first is really where the data is coming from. And you can see here kind of the different sources. So is it primary or secondary data? Is it collected for the purpose of this specific research? So it could be something like a prospective observational study, a register, or something like this that was designed to collect, the data for research, or is it secondary data? So initially, for example, collected for finance or for other purposes, and then used for research. So that is a secondary data use. The other thing is then, of course, the interventional versus non-interventional studies, or interventional studies versus observational studies. Interventional studies are kind of the typical clinical trials. You have there the approach that there is, treatment, for example, in intervention, or lots of other kind of protocol-driven interventions. Also observational studies, where we basically just look over the shoulder of the physician and understand what he's doing. Now, there's also the pragmatic studies that are kind of in between these. They are kind of usually kind of interventional studies, but they want to be as observational as possible, so to say. So they try to have as little kind of additional interventions through the protocol as possible. And of course, observational studies, there's also differences across different countries. For example, what is non-interventional? In certain countries, you can have, more or less as many patient-reported outcomes as you like, and even have some, blood tested and laboratory testing, because if you can justify that, well, this is clinical practice, then you actually can record things around this. Whereas in other countries, a little bit too many PROs and things like this could be seen as an intervention in itself. So even kind of certain diagnostic things could be seen as an intervention. So that depends always a little bit from the local setup. The other last point is, do you look forward or do you look backward? So do you start to collect the data and have a study description or something like this, a protocol, and then you said kind of, okay, we want to collect these data, and you move forward. Then, of course, you can collect exactly the data that you need in a very standardized way, and everything is fine. But it takes quite some time and usually is pretty expensive. Or you look retrospectively, what is already there? Yeah, and this could be existing studies, could be registries, could be claims databases, any kind of existing data. And of course, that can be both secondary or primary data. Yeah, and so you can have differences between these. Of course, some of these are mutually exclusive. Yeah, so I think all interventional studies are in a way prospective, but of course, once kind of you look into them kind of as a post hoc analysis 3 years later, maybe you can see it as, well, retrospectively, we look into this prospectively collected data. So you can come up with all kind of different terms for these different things. There's a lot of, let's say, gray zones in here, and it's very often not as straightforward. Also, it could be kind of combinations of these. Yeah, maybe you combine primary data that is, and you link it to kind of secondary data in terms of you have a study and you link it to some claims data, or you have parts that is, prospective, but also looks into retrospective data. And as I said, there's the pragmatic studies that are kind of in the middle between interventional and observational studies. So all these kind of different things you can help to understand kind of what is actually real world data and real world evidence, and better create a grip on this terminology. So let's go into the landscape of what are all the different areas of real world data and real world evidence. And the next slide. So here we have large variety of different sources of real world data. And with that, I want to hand back to Rachel, because she has worked quite a lot in a couple of these.
Sure. So I think the area where I have the most experience is with the electronic health records. And this can compromise many different sources. It could be in primary care, so with GPs, outpatient settings. It could also be in secondary care, so in hospitals, AEs. I think in the US they use ER. So it's mostly any kind of records that are collected electronically that you can then anonymize and use for research purposes. The difficulty here is it's not often collected specifically for research purposes. It's often collected so that there's a history of what the patient experiences, collected to inform patients and other healthcare providers. And that one is, I think there's lots of guidelines and tips and tricks for how you can work with that effectively. Another one that's sort of related to electronic healthcare records is administrative claims. So these can be insurance claims. They could be different ways that services are being reimbursed, or billing claims as well. And this one is a little bit challenging because oftentimes it's administrative. So the things that are collected are used to process and reimburse the provider of the services. So occasionally it may not have the variables or characteristics of interest that you might want to study. Then, as we progress along the top, we also have product or disease registries. Now, these are often set up to explore the product a little bit more or the disease area a little bit more. So, for example, in the UK, there is a cancer registry, and this is where a lot of cancer patients' information is collected. And it's a little bit more usage for research purposes, although since it is retrospective, sometimes you can't go back and collect missing information or correct information as well. So from there, we've got environmental factors, and these could be, pollen counts or pollution. A lot of it is publicly available, but very interesting to combine with the other research that we have available to us.
Yeah, you see that, for example, in the COVID situation, it could be kind of the regulation in terms of restrictions, lots of these kind of different things that, of course, have an influence on the spread of the disease and can be different between different countries as well as changing over time. And therefore, if you want to model and understand these kind of things, you need to take these into account. Next point is a patient-reported outcomes. We just talked about this. This topic that is coming up all the time. But it can also be patient-generated health data. So it could be more kind of data that is coming from wearables or other things. So there's a kind of fine line with biometric monitoring devices. So yeah, like the wearables, yeah, like my watch, which measures the heart rate and how well you sleep and all these kind of different things. And lastly, it can be surveys and questionnaires. So patient-reported outcomes are probably usually something that is more designed and validated and lots of these things. And surveys and questionnaires are maybe more kind of something that you maybe do online, yeah, where you look within Facebook or within any other social media platforms, maybe on TikTok, if that is your kind of target population that you want to look into for certain aspects of what is important for patients, for example. So let's go into the next one.
Which we've got another poll question here. So when do you think real-world evidence could be used? And we've got 4 different faces to choose from.
Yeah, and of course, choose any what you like. People choose phase 1 and phase 4, phase 2, phase 3. And the funny thing is, actually, you can use it anywhere. For all these different aspects, even in the preclinical field, you can use it to better understand, okay, what are the treatment patterns out there? What are the interesting diseases? What is the development? What are the prognostic factors? All kind of different things in real world can help you to design, these different phases. Within phase 1, maybe you want to understand what are the different communications we need to take into account. What are kind of patients that we need to have a look into? What are co-medications we need to take into account? In phase 2, understanding how your drug works against existing other products. What are relevant comparators to look into? How long should your studies be? What kind of outcomes to expect? Lots of different things. But also when we think about historic controls and enriching placebo or standard of care treatment arms, there's a lot of real-world evidence used there. And of course, then in phase 4, we talk about a lot of these things because then when the drug is on the market, then you can actually observe this drug in real-world evidence. So when people talk about we need more real-world evidence prior to launch, then that is, of course, only real-world evidence that is coming from either under the FDA definition from within clinical trials, so PROs, for example, be off the compound, and then in real life, so to say. So when people ask for, we need more real-world evidence before we actually start the launch the compound, then it's really important to have the discussion about what real-world evidence is needed and why it's needed. Okay, let's get into the next ones.
So here is a top-line summary of different ways RWE can be used, and we'll go through each one a little bit more in depth in a moment. So safety studies is a very common one. We can also use RWE to study efficacy, real-life utilization. We can explore sensitive populations. We can also do comparisons with RWE. We can do patient outcomes, clinical outcome assessments, and patient-centered outcome assessments. And we can also explore patient preferences as well.
Just one note here. We have here efficacy on it and safety on it. We don't have here tolerability and effectiveness on it. I think these two terms should be basically deleted from our vocabulary and not be used in terms of effectiveness is what we study in observational research, and efficacy is what we study in clinical research. I think after all the estimates discussions, we should be more kind of talking about estimates and not kind of lump it up with efficacy versus effectiveness and safety versus tolerability. So that's just a little bit of a side note.
Thank you. So let's look first at safety. So one of the big benefits that RWE offers is you can look at large sample sizes that would be very difficult to acquire in a clinical trial. And because we have a much larger sample size, we're able to detect adverse events or side effects that were not detected within the clinical trials. And this provides a cost-effective way for sponsors to showcase that their product is safe for the patients that they serve. So I think a big example of this one is the post-authorization safety studies or PASS studies that you may hear people use. And I think that's one of the biggest showcases of it. But of course, you can use it to explore other ways to see if different sensitive populations also experience it too, which we'll explore a little bit more.
Yeah, or you want to understand certain side effects that occur only over longer period of time. Yeah, or in those studies, patient populations that were previously not included in the study, or that maybe have changed over the years. Yeah, other pre-treatment, other communications, lots of different reasons why populations change. But the other side, of course, the efficacy side also plays a role. Yeah, and also randomized controlled studies are the gold standard in some circumstances. They may not be possible or ethical. So synthetic controls or historic controls can be used to bump up your standard of care or potentially completely replace your standard of care if you have really big effect sizes. And of course, here again, we think about real-world evidence in a way that it's coming from not clinical trials and kind of augmented. It's here not so much about PROs. Of course, PROs can come from RCTs, and we can measure the impact of a treatment on PROs all the time.
Right. Another thing we can study is real-life utilization. So maybe we're interested in how much of the population suffers from the disease. It could help us inform how big of the population that could be using the potential product that we're interested in. We could also quantify the burden of disease on patients or the healthcare system. So perhaps there's one drug that's doing really well, and patients really like it a lot. However, maybe they have to go into hospital and or have checkups or have visits a little bit more frequently than, say, another one. That would be interesting to study as well. And that kind of blends into the cost effectiveness of the treatment. So we could see how much further interventions or how many other visits, A&E visits they have, for example, on one drug versus another drug of interest. Another one that's a hot topic is adherence, compliance, and persistence. And these are also available with real-world evidence. So these are ways for researchers to understand how well patients comply to the dosing regimen of a treatment, or if they take the drug on time, or if there's maybe some disconnect in how frequently they should be taking it and how frequently they actually take the drug. So there's many different types of real-life utilization, but some common ones are incidence or prevalence studies, healthcare utilization studies, and of course the treatment pattern studies. I think that so HTAs is a really broad category as well, but real-life utilization could be, these are different examples that you could use to support an HTA submission as well. Then another category of what you can use it for is sensitive populations, as I alluded to earlier. So there are some individuals that are really difficult to include in trials. For example, pregnant women or lactating women. So outside of this RCT setting, these populations naturally end up taking the medication. It could be by accident or it could be prescribed. But that offers the ability to research the outcomes on this subgroup that weren't able to be researched in a clinical trial. So in addition to maybe pregnant or lactating women and how well they tolerate the medication, or if the fetus is able to handle it, if it passes that placenta barrier, the real-world evidence studies are able to detect if there's harm on the babies. We also can study how young or elderly individuals handle the medication.
Yeah, and here COVID is another really good example. Yeah, if you look into when the FDA approved certain vaccines for teenagers, for kids, that was much faster than in Europe. And therefore, we had much more data from outside of clinical trials when we were approving the medication or using the medication here in Europe compared to the US, because we had the experience from the US. And that, of course, helped quite a lot in terms of feeling more secure about it. There was these couple of very severe incidences in terms of the cardiological impact of certain medications. And learning about how to manage that in the best way, of course, increased the safety of the users of vaccines here in Europe. And I can tell that this personally helped me quite a lot in my decision whether I want to vaccinate my kids and what to do about it in order to prevent these side effects. The next point is comparisons. And comparisons is maybe an umbrella term for both safety and efficacy. When we run clinical trials, we can only run a certain number of them, and we can only include a certain number of the treatments. However, when we look into a couple of different therapeutic areas or indications, there's lots of different drugs, and actually it's increasing over time. So it is very often impossible to run all these head-to-head studies against each other. And even if you would do, they wouldn't be necessarily consistent to each other. Maybe they're coming from different sponsors, they use different designs, all kind of different things. And here, of course, you can do real-world evidence if you include NMA into these decisions, or you could run more larger observational studies, prospective observational studies, including many different treatments. So more indication-specific observational studies rather than treatment or drug-specific observational studies. To be honest, I'm a pretty big fan of these larger indication-specific observational studies. There are a couple of very, very nice examples in the literature. If you look, for example, into schizophrenia, there's a couple of really nice ones that compare these. Or there's in dermatology, there's a couple of these, where you could see over a very long period of time in very diverse populations how different treatments compare against each other. And these were very vital to better understand effectiveness, efficacy, safety, adherence, time to treatment discontinuation, all kind of different questions in the real life for different populations. So both network meta-analysis as well as prospective observational studies are very good here. But of course, you can also look into claims data, and understand, for example, how long patients are taking medications to better understand how the drugs perform against each other. The next point is, again, the slides that we talked about quite a lot, patient outcomes. So here, of course, it's really very much for the, let's say, primary source data, not so much for the secondary source data, because in lots of claims data and things like this will not have patient-reported outcomes. But if you think about observational studies in terms of registry, prospective observational studies, surveys, things like that, as well also, of course, PROs in clinical trials, you can much better understand about the experience of the patient for things that are really difficult to measure from an outside. So this could be, for example, itch in dermatology, or fatigue in many different therapeutic areas, mood, yes, things like anxiety, depression, things like that. You pretty much can only study by asking the patient. And the patient-reported outcomes are really the big factor here. Next slide. Patient preferences is, in a way, also patient outcome. Maybe not so much an outcome, it's a preference, but it really talks about what's important for the patient and what is kind of the trade-off for the patient. So let's say you have one drug that is very efficacious, but also not that safe, and you have another drug that is not as efficacious, but safer. What do you prefer? Interestingly, very often physicians will go for the safe option, whereas patients will go for the effective option, because they have different preferences. Their attitude to risk is different. And of course, the patient will get a lot of gain from the efficacy, whereas the physician, of course, needs to deal with the safety. Of course, the patient as well, but kind of the physician, happy patient if he gets all the efficacy, but it's not really directly affecting him. But managing side effects, it can be really nasty. There's quite interesting research in this area also to, for example, better understand what kind of preferences are there in terms of dosing schemes, in terms of, for example, how fast drug works, how long it works. Also, what side effects are most kind of irritating for the patient. If you have different side effects, like one drug is causing insomnia and the other one is causing pain, what's worse? Ask the patient. This is exactly where the patient preference studies come in. And there's different designs that can help you to explore these, like discrete choice experiments and others. It's a whole area of research, really, really interesting, but perfect for these kind of real-world evidence studies. Next slide.
Excellent.
Yep.
So as you can see, real-world evidence can be used in many different ways. And in particular, there's 3 different healthcare stakeholders, and they may use the results to help inform their decisions in different ways. So for example, we divided it into physicians and providers, payers, and regulatory decision makers. Because they're all interested in, of course, improving patient lives, but from a different angle or a different perspective. So physicians and providers may be interested in calculating treatment adherence, monitoring safety, assessing adverse events, and basically understanding when certain interventions are more effective in specific patient subgroups. On the other hand, payers, they're a little bit more interested in the cost effectiveness. So evaluating the cost effectiveness of interventions. They might make drug coverage decisions and try to improve the affordability of healthcare and assess the relevance of competitors. The regulatory decision makers, these ones will have insight throughout the entire process, but they'll be most interested in post-market surveillance. They may help to support or make decisions on guidelines and support tools. They're interested in understanding the background safety profiles, and they can extrapolate or augment clinical trials.
And all these areas, real-world evidence can be really nicely used. And of course, there's more than that, but here are a couple of big ones where real-world evidence helps you to use these. So one of the important things is whenever you work on your overall evidence package, not just look into what you can do with clinical trials, also think about what you can do with real-world evidence. I just recently had a really, really nice discussion. There was a sponsor that went back to the FDA a couple of years after the launch of a product and found out, oh, there was one question we never actually answered to the FDA. And so there was a lot of discussion, oh, do we need to run another study? Yeah, for that, we would need to run another study. Yeah, let's run another study. But that takes so long. And until someone mentioned, well, we have this drug on the market for a couple of years. We should actually know whether that still is a relevant question. And so they looked into the real-world evidence data and saw it's not a question anymore. And it's not relevant anymore. And with this data, they went to the FDA and the FDA was happy with it. So think about it, yeah? When you are a couple of years into your product life cycle after launch, there's a lot of real-world evidence out there that can help to answer relevant questions or to show that these questions are not relevant anymore.
Great. Well, I think we have another poll question. What is your key takeaway from the webinar today?
Yep, and this one is an open-ended one, just kind of put in there what you think was really, one of the key learnings for you. Okay, let's see what's coming here. Yep, there's lots of different stakeholders involved in real-world evidence, all the different ways to use real-world evidence. We talked quite a lot about the external use of real-world evidence. Of course, there's a lot of company internal use of real-world evidence as well to prepare these. So, for example, if you want to understand how your drug compares against existing treatment options, this is really good. If you want to understand, are there any, treatment patterns that you need to, think about for your economic model, if you think about for designing your studies, this is really good. Very powerful tool. We should be utilizing it more in drug development. Yes. Diversity of evidence available. That's an interesting one. Rachel, what do you think about this?
I think that's a really good and interesting one. There's many different uses of it, and it can be from a simple informative thing to trying to understand the root cause of maybe why one drug is more expensive than another drug, not just in the amount that it actually physically costs, but in terms of down the road, how much, maybe one is more adherent than the other, and that leads to more hospitalizations, which leads to, more safety issues for the patient. So it's really vast, and yeah, the diversity of different options is a great way to summarize it.
Yes, the interesting thing, it's, the real world evidence is diverse, different sources, different data sets. Interestingly, there's a lot of diversity within these as well. Yeah. Whereas if you have a clinical trial that is, just by protocol made to be pretty homogeneous, in real world evidence, you have all kind of different things. Yeah. So if you have a large observational study, you will find anything in there. Yeah. I once had a study in bipolar disorder, and there was one patient that had 20,000 cycles in terms of moving upwards and downwards over the history of the life. And we think that's impossible. We queried it even, and the physician said, yes, he is a rapid cycler and he is that long on disease, therefore about 20,000 cycles. And so you find kind of pretty extreme things in these studies. So yeah, there's a lot of diversity in there. It is very helpful and changed my perspective about real-world evidence and real-world data usage. I came to know the vast area and where these are used. Thank you so much for such an informative webinar. Thanks so much for, for that. By the way, this webinar is recorded, and we'll make it available later on our homepage. So if you check out Verimat, you'll find all the webinars there. And Andrew, maybe you can just put the link into the chat for people to find it, or we can send it afterwards to the attendees. So if you find it useful, make sure that you point colleagues to these recordings as well. Okay, what are our key takeaways?
So I think actually one of the things I really like a lot is this area is constantly finding new data to be collected through apps and wearables, and it's evolving so much that trends are taking off in many directions. It's hard to explain them all in one webinar, but there's many different avenues that researchers are using this data to help drive and make sure that we have the best healthcare available.
Yeah, I think also stakeholders are much more open to using it. There's a lot of initiatives both in Europe and in the US to make better use of these. The analytical tools that we have at hand are very different to what we had, let's say, 20 years ago. And so there's a lot of more options here.
Yes. So here are the key takeaways that we wanted to summarize from the webinar. Firstly, real-world data, it's certainly not well-defined, as we kind of covered, yet I think a lot of people accept it to be data that's collected outside of a clinical trial. However you'd like to define that, though, is a bit up for discussion. But that data forms the basis of what real-world evidence is, which is the clinical evidence derived from the analysis of however you decide to define real-world data. And finally, as I think some of the attendees mentioned in the last poll question, but RWE can be used to by many different stakeholders to inform healthcare decisions to ultimately improve patient lives and advance healthcare.
Yeah, so thanks so much for attending this webinar. We'll now open up to general kind of Q&A and put your questions in there. And while you enter these questions, I just want to inform you about an offer that we have. If you would like to learn more about launch and commercialization, about how you can build strategically your evidence in the best way, how you can maximize your publication planning, how you can analyze your data and exploring it using different data analytical tools, so data mining, or whether you want to talk about HTA submissions around the world, how to improve your customer interactions, and lastly, of course, how to leverage real-world evidence, just book a 60-minute coaching session with me. And the link Andrew put in there, just use this Calendly link, and then you can select the slot directly from my calendar and talk to me. Quite very easy. So there's some publics. There's just Andrew put it into the public chat. So real-world evidence, one of the fun areas for statisticians to work on. Once someone told me, well, analyzing clinical trials, that's easy, because if you have done your design well, then the analysis of it is actually quite straightforward. I think I would take that with a little bit of a caveat, but he said, real-world evidence, this is really a challenge. That is where you as a statistician need to be much better at it, because there's much more kind of challenges to overcome. There's much more opportunities. If you have a lot of variability in your data, of course, as a statistician, you can do much more with it. What's your perception? What's your experience in terms of real-world evidence and analyzing real-world evidence? Is it fun?
I think it's fun. I think that there's new challenges, I guess, that, people are doing their PhDs on. So, of course, there's real advanced ways to handle bias and whatnot that are coming out of universities and people's minds. So that's really, really fun to stay on top of, or try to stay on top of, because there's new stuff coming all the time. I don't have that much experience with RCTs, but I think, the level of complexities to consider, there are complexities in both RCTs and RWE, but they're different. And RWE experiences confounding, which I think is one of the biggest hurdles to overcome, since it's not as well defined, and you kind of have to create this sandbox that you're then going to perform the analysis within. So
yeah. And over the next months, we'll actually have a couple of further webinars coming up. And in some of these, we will talk about exactly the things that Rachel just mentioned. Bias control or bias adjustment techniques will be one of these. Interestingly, these were really developed for observational research, but funnily, they are now also used on clinical trials to better have estimate the right estimates, or the estimates that are of interest. So if you have differential dropout in clinical trials, that is a typical scenario where you could potentially use some of these bias adjustment methods to overcome the challenges that come with differential dropout. Or if you have some other areas that are kind of different dosing or whatsoever, anything that happens after randomization can kind of lead to some kind of form of bias, depending what kind of estimate you are interested in. And the different observational research methods can help you to overcome that. Okay, any other questions? I don't see any red notes coming here in terms of Q&A. Rachel, do you have any final question or any final comment?
No, I don't have any additional ones, but I guess, I look forward to seeing how the real-world evidence area evolves and the new trends that are coming up in the future. It's going to be a really exciting ride.
Yep. Yeah, there's currently lots of going on, especially on the FDA side. I've also recorded just an episode about that for the Effective Statistician. So if you listen to my podcast, you'll hear some things about real-world evidence there as well. But most importantly, check out the 60-minute coaching session with me, and it would be awesome to talk to you. Otherwise, I would say, let's stop here. Have a great time, and see you for the next webinar or in the coaching session. Bye.
Bye.